I think for these purposes, you should say that I was the transportation director of the 1963 March on Washington. I'm now retired, and before I retired, I was the political director of the American Federation of Teachers. So,
in 1963, 50 years ago, how did you come to be the transportation director? Did you just walk in and said, hey, you need some help, or what?
no. I met Bayard Rustin in 1957 when he was organizing, at that point, support for the Montgomery bus protest. And there were rallies in New York and various kinds of demonstrations and fundraisers. And I, along with a young man named Tom Kahn, sort of began as being sort of permanent volunteers for this, for Bayard. And the other person who was around a lot was Bob Moses, who went to Mississippi and was sort of the hero of the Mississippi movement. And we just got more and more active in the civil rights movement as it began to grow and active and working on Northern support. And Bayard and Mr. Randolph organized 3 marches before the 1963 march. In 1957, the prayer pilgrimage, where Dr. King spoke. And it was primarily in support of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was just beginning to form, and the Montgomery boycott. And Dr. King there gave an incredibly wonderful speech called Give Us the Ballot. It was for voting rights. Then there were 2 subsequent marches they were called the Youth Marches for Integrated Schools, and they were in support of school integration in the South. So by 1963, having started at 17, I was a veteran marcher and a veteran demonstrator. And in fact, I had worked with Bayard on some of the plans for the upcoming 63 March. That I should be transportation director was not initially apparent to me. And Bayard, as he was figuring out who was going to do what on the staff, and most of the staff were people sent over from organizations so that wouldn't have to be paid. He said to me, I think you should coordinate the transportation and the buses. And I said to him now, which sounds incredibly silly, how could I possibly do that? I can't drive, as if one has to drive. And I said, and also I'm dyslexic about direction. I always get things wrong. And he said to me with, I think, amazing perception, no, you are compulsive. And what I want is somebody doing this who will not lose the name of anybody who wants to go to this march and who needs to get a bus and will stay on top of it. So you're doing it. And that was it. Lonnie Bunch at the African American Museum asked me one night, what gives a 24-year-old the courage to do this? And I said, clearly, it was Bayard Rustin. I mean, he just said to me, you're going to do this. You can do it. I know you can.
And you did it.
And I did it.
Well, you also told us about how you ended up having buses parked on the mall, which they never let them park there and stay. How'd you do that?
Well, anybody who worked on the march will tell you that Bayard had a wonderful capacity to listen to everybody, to delegate, and then to put it all together. So every day we had a staff meeting, and people discussed what was supposed to happen. And a lot of the times you sort of had to imagine yourself on the march from the minute you woke up to getting there to see what was going to happen. And since I had been on 3 other marches, and at every one of them, I was the person who got off a bus, went to the demonstration, and couldn't find her bus. And because they moved them, and I don't think I would, and we had a very elaborate system that each bus had to have a bus captain, and the bus captain would give people instructions about what to do. The march itself was a very disciplined and well-organized thing. And I said to Bayard, if you want to get people out of the city easily, these buses can't move. Wherever they drop people off, they have to stay. And that made a lot of sense. And Bayard periodically, right before the march, would come down to Washington, I think once a week, to meet with the officials of the Justice Department and the Washington, D.C. Police Department to talk about logistics. And he told them that when the buses came, wherever they dropped people off. They were to stay there. And he was told in no uncertain terms that this did not happen, that buses were not allowed to stay on the mall. And Bayard rose to his full 6'2", put on his most imperious British accent, and said, "See here, my transportation director assures me there will be violence if so much as one bus is moved." And not a bus was moved. And I think it was the only time in history that happened, and it may very well up to then and may up until now. But it made an immense difference for people getting out of town and given the crowds.
This, as I understand it, the march was talked about for a long time, but it was really planned a month in advance?
It was planned for, Bayard began planning it in January. He wrote a memo. Norman Hill and Tom Kahn actually sent a memo to A. Philip Randolph saying, "We think this is the time and we should have a march." And it was really a march for jobs in January. And they began talking about it and planning it. And then I think certainly by the time the Birmingham demonstrations began and Medgar Evers was assassinated, it became clear that it had to be a march for jobs and freedom. And they were talking about it. Bayard was talking to Dr. King, and Mr. Randolph was talking to Roy Wilkins. And we were meeting, I would say, in April and May at night, drawing up the plans, where we would go, where the money would come from, the logistics of it. But it was not agreed upon by everybody until I think June 22nd. And so in a period of 6 weeks, the actual organization to the people began, and we began organizing it.
How many people did you anticipate coming?
We had hoped for 100,000 people, 150,000 people at most. But somehow, I don't know why, I can't remember why 100,000 was the magic number. But certainly we wanted that. The previous marches had maybe had 20,000, 25,000 people. So we wanted certainly a bigger number.
When you saw what's estimated to be 250,000, what did you think?
We were ecstatic. I mean, that is, we knew at some point during the day, as you saw this mall filling in and people coming, you knew that we had gone over any limit. And we certainly could tell at the expanse all the way down from the Lincoln Memorial of how great it was. And it was not only the size of the crowd, it was the nature of the crowd. That is, it was a day where everybody was extremely joyful about being there, but knew what they were doing. I mean, they knew they were on a march, they knew they were in a protest, but they were also, I think, so overjoyed by the numbers that it was a crowd that was extremely polite, well-behaved, very happy, and just wonderful to be around. So I had a little badge that said staff, and at one point, I don't know, I had to run from one place to another. Everybody said, "Oh, please go through." It was just incredibly nice. It was August 28th in Washington, D.C. is really a scorcher of a day. And people fainted, they'd be lifted up and moved very gently. It was just a wonderful crowd. We had marshals who were never used. It was really wonderful. Bayard had trained in New York more than 150 black men who were members of two auxiliary groups. The police department and the fire department in New York had auxiliary groups made up of their black officers, and they volunteered to be the marshals. And Bayard had to train them in nonviolence. Black policemen don't know nonviolence any more than any other kind of policeman. And Bayard taught them that they would have to encircle crowds and not push them. And there was a very big effort to make sure that we had our own marshals and that they were nonviolent. The Justice Department and the police department offered some of their policemen, and Bayard said, "No. If you're going to send any police here, put them on the outside of the crowd and let them watch for the Klan and counter demonstrations. We will monitor ourselves." So here was a day when these marshals literally did nothing. It was really very sweet. They stood around, they watched the crowd, everybody was, there was not the hint of an incident during that day.
Were there any
No.
anti-protesters?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know if there was anybody way on the outside?
I don't know what happened. I don't know whether
Yeah.
they were there. I mean, whatever it is, it didn't matter.
Yeah. What, on the morning of the 28th, what time did you get up?
I think about, I don't think I really slept. I think I got up at about 4 or 5.
And what did you do?
We were staying at the Statler Hotel, the Statler Hilton. This is Washington, D.C., by the way, in 1963. There were probably only two integrated hotels, the Willard and the Statler Hilton. The staff of the march stayed at the Statler Hilton, and Bayard did. And I think Mr. Randolph did. Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King were over at the Willard. We got up and we went to the mall, and we waited. And since this was the untechnological days, we had some phones set up at a tent at the Washington Monument. And at one point, Bayard and I was standing there, and it was empty on the mall. It was gray and misty, and it's about 5 in the morning. And it's another wonderful Bayard story. These reporters came up to him, and they said, Mr. Rustin, nobody's here. This is going to be a failure. Or is this a failure? And Bayard picked up a yellow foolscap pad in one hand, and he looked at his watch. He had used a pocket watch in the other hand. And he looked down, and he looked up, and he said, no, we are absolutely on schedule. And he put it down. And I said to him, what did you look at? He said, a blank piece of paper. We knew that the trains would start coming in at Union Station at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And we knew that the chartered planes would be coming in about the same time. You could never be sure about the buses. But I think at about 8:30 or 9, they began rolling in. And people began coming in from Union Station, and they walked from Union Station to the Washington Monument first, and they were singing, and they had the signs, and it was all fine and wonderful. There was just this brief period.
It sounds like Mr. Rustin was not only a charismatic leader, but a pretty shrewd guy.
Pretty shrewd, very smart, very shrewd, yeah. And he was also, if Mr. Randolph brought to the civil rights movement the concept that you had to have mass action, and also it was Mr. Randolph's notion, and really his argument for many years, that you had to bring that action to Washington, D.C., that there could be no significant change unless the federal government and the Congress was involved. Bayard was the genius of nonviolence and of the strategy that made that possible.
What do you think, over the period of 50 years, what do you think history has forgotten about that march? Everybody knows about Martin Luther King's speech. And if you ask 10 people, they'll say, yes, I remember the speech. But what has history not remembered about that day?
That it was a march for jobs and freedom. That is, history doesn't, and God knows, our legislature hasn't confronted the problems of jobs, and it is still particularly difficult, obviously, in the black community, in the brown and black community. The unemployment rates are very high. And interestingly enough, it's not only jobs, it was also economic justice. One of the slogans of the march was for a higher minimum wage. And we still are struggling with the problem of a higher minimum wage. So there was a series of economic demands made at that march that were much more difficult to confront, it turns out, and that still need to be discussed and addressed.
Was the march a success?
Oh, I think it was an immense success. I mean, it was a success, not because it achieved everything it should achieve, but it was a success because, first of all, it put to death a terrible stereotype. At the beginning of the march, when we started to plan it, there was hysteria that black folks could not gather on the streets of Washington without riots. And Bayard, in fact, said, yeah, they think, that if 10 Negroes, as he would call people then, stood on a corner, they think there's going to be a riot. And also that the civil rights movement did not have the capacity to do that. So I think, first of all, it ended that stereotype once and for all, that this was a movement that obviously could really do significant things. Secondly, I think that at that point, there was a great sort of unwashed part of our population. That is, white people who weren't racists, but who hadn't made a stand for civil rights and didn't know where they stood. And very interestingly, Rabbi Yochanan Prince's speech at the march addresses that. He says that when he was the rabbi in Berlin during Hitler's rise, and I'm going to paraphrase him badly, he realized that the greatest problem were people who didn't speak out, people who didn't join the struggle. And I think this day, which was the first time, by the way, that television did floor-to-floor coverage, it was the first event, so to speak, was a time when, in fact, white America saw a movement. And that's the importance of the I Have a Dream speech, that it gave them a vision and it changed that notion. So I think it was very significant for that. And I think that people who were there also went back to their home communities and continued to organize, so that it galvanized a group of leaders. And certainly the major thing is that we had to follow the march with activities to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And it's complicated passing a bill, but it was certainly a pivotal point in passing the bill.
Are you glad you were a participant?
Oh, yeah. No, I feel like I was the luckiest person in the world that Bayard did me a tremendous favor by saying, "Come along, help me make history," and I was able to help and do that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I am extremely happy for having had that experience and been a part of it. Yeah.
We know what you think of Bayard Rustin. What do you think of A. Philip Randolph and the leaders of Roy Wilkins and all the other?
I think they were an extraordinary group of men. Mr. Randolph towers above anybody, and when I try to describe him to young people, I say to them, think Nelson Mandela. I mean, to try to think of Mr. Randolph's persona, you have to really think of Nelson Mandela. It's the only thing that comes close in my mind. But I mean, he was incredible. I mean, he was a man born in Jacksonville, Florida. He played in the Negro Leagues baseball, did Shakespearean stuff, but came to New York and became a writer and an organizer on the streets of Harlem, and had serious debates on the street corner speaking, but also in writing in the Messenger with Booker T. Washington, who is dead, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and introducing this concept of mass action. He became the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, a union which really was really the backbone of black organization in the South. I mean, these sleeping car porters were very interesting. I mean, they'd be saying yes or yes ma'am to the people on the train, then they'd be giving out copies of black newspapers and organizing. And the most incredible thing about Mr. Randolph, I could go on forever, is that at one point when he was president of the union, the Pullman car company gave him a blank check and said, fill it out, it's yours. Needless to say, he ripped it up, and he lived his whole life until near the end, in a small apartment in Harlem. His wife was a cosmetologist, she did cosmetics.
Yeah, cosmetologist.
Yeah, cosmetologist, and made a decent wage doing that in Harlem, and she supported him. Near the end, he moved down to a really simple cooperative apartment in New York City where Bayard Rustin lived, just so they could be close together. But he certainly is a hero of the movement. And he was certainly Bayard's image and inspiration. And
well, let me ask you this: how are we doing on the tape there? We good?
You got about 10 minutes.
Okay. So here's a picture of the March on Washington.
yeah,
Where are you?
I am actually back here. I'm on the podium someplace. So I was on the podium the day of the march. I said the podium is, as you can see, here's the, I'm not wearing,
There's the podium.
here's the speakers,
Right.
and here's everybody sitting. The people all behind here were representatives of the sponsoring organizations, staff
Okay.
people, potential speakers. It's the only place, by the way, where you'll see there are park police up there. That is, Bayard obviously let them in to protect the speakers. And so I'm up here someplace, and I was there watching, listening, carrying on. One of my jobs before the march actually began was when we had a tent at the Washington Monument. I was supposed to answer questions if a bus driver called or if a car called, and if they had problems. And there was a we had no technology. It was just a regular phone, and I gave them a brilliant answer, which was, if they called and they said our bus broke down, I said, hitch a ride with the next bus, and they did. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there were breakdowns on the road. And everybody was very genial. And as far as I know, everybody got in. Nobody was stranded in Cambridge, Maryland, or Delaware or anything.
Boy, how did you decompress after that day? What did you do the next day? How are you going to top that?
You can't. I mean, I don't know. I know what we did the day of the march, and there's a very funny photograph, which we can. Those of us who were on the staff at the end of the march, when everybody was leaving, went below the Lincoln Memorial. And we linked arms and we sang "We Shall Overcome." And we weren't going to leave. I mean, we were there singing, and we weren't going to leave. And I think we were the only group that the marshals, our marshals, had to do something about. They came and they circled us with their arms. But John Lewis was there, and Bob Moses, and Eleanor Norton, and the Ladners, and Tom Kahn. The leaders of the march, Dr. King, the chairman, all had gone over to see President Kennedy. President Kennedy had decided he wasn't going to meet with them until after the march. He was going to make sure, they were going to make sure it was a good day. And if something, because this town was terrified by the violence. It's hard to emphasize how much, I mean, they had all sorts of contingency plans for the big riot that was going to take place. But they had gone over to meet with the president, and those of us on the staff staying. And also we had instructed in the manuals that everybody was to leave town afterwards. You shouldn't stay in town, but we stayed in town and partied. Let me just tell you one other thing. 2 weeks after the march, however, this euphoria ended with a thud, and that was the bombing of the 16th Avenue Church in Birmingham. That is, it was if we had thought that the beloved community, and we did, the atmosphere the day of the march was as if the beloved community had been achieved. 2 weeks later, we were told, not so fast. And this bombing took place in Birmingham. So everybody then got back to business, and the period of euphoria was ended. And I think also for some of the kids in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and even for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they left that march and they went right back down south. So they didn't get time to decompress. I mean, they had to continue the struggle.
Yeah.
I think it's the poetry of Dr. King that is very important, and that we should never underestimate that. I think the concepts, the life of Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph is more complicated. And because it's more complicated, it isn't dealt with quickly. And I think also it engenders more disagreement. That is, not everybody agrees with the economic demands that A. Philip Randolph made. Bayard was gay, was not in the closet, and had a difficult history. And I think people sort of didn't want to deal with that. And also the fact of the matter is that he intentionally kept himself behind. He didn't thrust himself into the forefront because he knew that it would be used by enemies of civil rights against the movement. And And so he had been a conscientious objector during World War II. He was a homosexual. He had been a member of the Communist Party in his youth. I mean, he was very young. And all those things were used against him and had been used against him in the movement. And he never wanted the movement to be hurt by that. One of the things that happened during the march, and I'm sorry, I'll go back. It's the reason that Randolph was called the director and Bayard was called the deputy director. And it was Roy Wilkins' way, who was nervous about what they would do in terms of Bayard, of making sure that he wasn't so out front. As the march, to people covering the march itself, it became clear the role he played. And then Strom Thurmond, about a week before the march, got up on the floor of the Senate and issued a huge denunciation of Bayard for being a draft dodger, homosexual. And it couldn't have come at a better time, because the march was already a full success, and it came from Strom Thurmond. So everybody knew what this was about. And I think Bayard, in fact, issued a statement saying he wouldn't have cared if I were a murderer. He just wanted to go after the march. And Roy Wilkins, who had been really reluctant to have Bayard organize it because of this, actually was the first person out to make a full statement about it.
Do you think if Dr. King's speech hadn't been so powerful, the rest of the march would have gotten the attention that it did?
It's very ironic. The day of the march, the I Have a Dream section didn't get as much publicity as other parts. The USIA made a film which ended with his soliloquy of "Free at Last." And although everybody thought the speech was great, and he was great, it was not so surprising. And I think one of the reasons is he had done the I Have a Dream part before in Detroit, and so people around had heard it. So right then, it was not the important thing. And I think maybe if you even look at the coverage following the march, it is not the I Have a Dream speech. It's the size of the crowd, it's the tenor, it's sometimes the movie actors, it's all sorts of things. And it's sort of seeped up historically to become the I Have a Dream speech. You know, it's hard to say what would have happened without it. I don't know. I really don't know.
What about the Hollywood types that were there? Charlton Heston and Marlon Brando. Did you expect them to be there? And what kind of impact did their presence have?
It was like the organization of the movie stars was, needless to say, its own little world. And the genius and wonderful person behind it was Ossie Davis, who was the prime organizer for the Hollywood group and he worked out of New York, and he really worked very hard, and he was totally un-diva-like. He came to staff meetings, and he would explain where the planes and buses were, and he worked a lot with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, and somehow, and I don't know very much about it, they established a Hollywood committee where I understand, and it's only rumor, that there were several arguments between Marlon Brando and Charlton Heston, but Charlton Heston in those days was a liberal. And so I think by the time they finished, every Hollywood movie star that had any sense, that had any liberalism at all, was there. Burt Lancaster, Shelley Winters, Judy Garland, and they arrived on their plane, and they had a special section on the podium. Everybody waved to them. Paul Newman was there. They were all there. But my favorite person for that day for the movie star, besides Ossie Davis, who was my own, was Lena Horne, because she refused to sit with the stars. She wore a simple outfit, and you probably can see her in some of the film. She was wearing a kerchief around her head, and she sat with the SNCC staff people. And when people came to interview her, she would say, "I'm not the story. This is Joyce Ladner from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I want you to talk to her." And she dragged some of them up to the press boxes. And she was also incredible. She just didn't behave like a movie star, and she just used her fame to help get publicity for the people who were there. And it was an incredible sight. You sort of saw her running around and doing stuff. It was really nice.
That's amazing.
It's an amazing
Yeah.
story about her.